Hello, everybody. This is the third and last review lecture for physical oceanography that covers the material that we covered after the second midterm. So mostly tides, but also climate modeling, geoengineering, and the guest lecture that we had by Audrey Parnell on climate modeling. And so I just want to emphasize that this material is going to be more strongly weighted on the final because it has not been tested yet. And so pay special attention in your preparation to especially the material on tides and the diagrams and stuff involved. And I will try to highlight those as we go through. Okay, so the physical force that is ultimately responsible for tides, we often actually call them tide generating forces, and in a couple of slides we'll get to that, but ultimately it's gravity at the base level underneath everything. And gravity, of course, is the universal attractive force between all massive objects. And the formula that gives the classical Newtonian gravitational force is on the bottom there. F equals minus g m1 m2 over r squared. And the r hat bold vector there just means that the force is along the line connecting the two. So it's an attractive force between the centers of mass, so don't worry too much about that. But a couple of key features of that force law is that it's proportional to the product of the masses. So if you double one of the masses, it doubles the force. If you double either mass, actually doubles the force. And then it's an inverse square law, meaning it depends on the 1 over the square of the distance between the objects. So if you double the distance between the two objects, the force goes down by a factor of 1 over 4. And this actually turns out to be important. The precise structure of this force law actually is important for the fact that the solar and lunar tides are about the same strength because the sun is much more massive but much further away, and just the nature of the force law ends up being such that those two effects approximately cancel. Okay, so we're going to talk about two different kinds of forces here that combine to create tides. And so one is the gravitational force, and the other is the centrifugal force, which we'll get to on the next slide. So the gravitational force here, just as shown in the diagram, every point on Earth feels a attractive force towards the moon, and that force points from that point on Earth to the center of the moon. So that's why some of the vectors are angled. So and there are two really important points on the Earth's surface that we discuss when we're discussing tides, and one is the zenith. So the zenith is the point on the Earth's surface that is closest to the moon, so directly sort of under the moon, and then the nadir is the furthest point away. So it's on the opposite side of the Earth from the zenith. And so because the zenith is the closest to the moon, it feels a stronger force. That's why the arrow is represented as longer. And on the other side, the nadir is further away. And so because of that 1 over r square law, that inverse square law, we've increased the distance, so we decrease the force. So on the nadir, there's a weaker gravitational attraction. And the other thing to keep in mind is that those angles shift as you go around your surface. They always point towards the center of the moon. Okay, so as the so we often think about the moon as orbiting around the Earth, but really they both sort of orbit each other. And so you can think of this. I like this picture in the upper right where the moon and the Earth are kind of swinging each other around, and they both orbit actually the common center of mass of the Moon-Earth system. But because the Earth is so much more massive than the Moon, the center of mass is actually very close. The center of mass of the Earth-Moon system is much closer to the Earth than to the Moon, and in fact it lies inside the Earth. But that's not a detail we spent a lot of time on. But so the Earth actually, the point is it's actually very important for tides that the Earth is not stationary as the Moon orbits it. The Earth is also doing its own kind of little circles as the Moon is circulating around the Earth. And so because the Earth is doing its own orbit, it has a centrifugal force. And so what this diagram is showing the red arrows are showing the centrifugal force. And there's a little bit of subtlety here, but basically because all of the points on Earth are in the same circular orbit, they all feel the same centrifugal force. And this points away from the moon, because it's just like, if you look at the picture of the Earth and the moon swinging each other around, the Earth is going to feel somehow thrown backwards away from its orbit as it swings around the moon. And the fact that the moon is holding its hands keeps it in the orbit. So that's the gravitational force and the centrifugal force are balancing each other out. You can think about it if you're on a merry-go-round or whatever. you feel like you're going to get thrown off, and the fact that you're holding onto the bars keeps you on. So holding onto the bars, that's the gravitational force, and feeling like you're going to get thrown off, that's the centrifugal force. So the centrifugal force is the same all around the Earth, but the gravitational force varies, and so that's what we showed on the last slide. The black arrow is the gravitational force, the resultant force is the vector sum. So you had to remember your vector additions shown down on the right-hand bottom right. The vector sum of the black arrow and the red arrow, and that gives the purple arrows. And the purple arrows are called the resultant, or the net force, or the tide generating force. And it's just the actual vector sum of the gravitational force and the centrifugal force. And what we can see when we do these vector additions is that we got some very interesting stuff. On the near side to the moon, and the nadir, we have on the right-hand side of the moon there, the purple arrow points towards the moon. And that's because on the near side, the zenith, the gravitational force is a little bit stronger than the centrifugal force because we're closer to the moon, so that gravitational force is stronger. So we get a pull towards the moon. The very interesting thing that happens is that on the other side, on the nadir side, the left-hand side of the Earth there, we also have a force, the purple resultant force, which points away from the moon. And this is because gravity is a little bit weaker on the nadir side because of the inverse square law, but the centrifugal force stays the same. So we end up with a tide generating force which points away from the moon. And so very interestingly, we have sort of bulging out forces, or pointing outward forces, on both the nadir side and the zenith side. The zenith side is kind of understandable because the gravitational force pulls the water, but the nadir side is a little bit more confusing because it's really the centrifugal force of the Earth orbiting that center of mass that sort of flings the water outward. And then on the top and bottom, we have these forces that squeeze inward, and then the net result of that is that water gets funneled into two tidal bulges, one that points toward the moon and one that points away from the moon. So this diagram shows the tidal bulges. And the key idea to keep in mind about how the tides actually work is that the moon, the gravitational tidal effects of the moon set up the tidal bulges. And you can kind of think of those as stationary. They change slowly as the moon orbits the Earth over a one month timescale. But the Earth, on a daily timescale, rotates within those stationary bulges. And so you think of the bulges as sticking in place, and then the Earth, on a 24-hour cycle, rotates through those bulges. So you experience high tide and low tide sequentially, because you are moving relative to the bulges. It's not that the bulges are moving, although they do move slowly as the moon orbits. So the period between two high tides, so there's two high tides a day because there's, in the sort of general simplest case, there are two high tides a day. Because we have two tidal bulges. And so in one 24-hour period, we might be started in one high tide, rotate through a low tide, 12 hours later we're back into a high tide, 18 hours later we're in low tide, and then back to 24 hours later we're back where we started in the high tide again. But it turns out that because the moon is slowly orbiting the Earth, the high tides don't come exactly 12 hours apart. They actually come 12 hours and 25 minutes apart because it operates on a lunar day rather than a solar day. So our normal solar day is the time it takes for the Earth to spin on its own axis. But as the moon orbits around, if you look at the figure, you see that as the Earth executes one 24-hour rotation, the moon has advanced a little bit in its orbit, and so the Earth has to rotate for an extra 50 minutes to catch up to where the moon is. So when we talk about high tides happening twice a day, it's kind of a slightly desynchronized with the actual typical Earth day. And so the tides don't always occur at the same time every day because there's this slow 50-minute drift that differs from day to day because the moon is orbiting. Yeah. Okay, so we mentioned the inverse square law. So in the inverse square law, gravity is stronger when the mass gets stronger, and it's weaker when the distance gets larger. And it just turns out there's this amazing cosmic coincidence that the sun is 27 million times more massive than the moon, but about 400 times further than the Earth, further from the Earth than is the moon. And so those two effects, they basically cancel roughly. And so the solar effect, solar gravity, also produces tidal bulges, one pointing toward the sun and one pointing away from the sun, exactly as in the moon. But they're comparable. It turns out the solar bulges are about half the size. So if you want to think about tides, the main thing is the moon, but the sun is also very important, so they are comparable. It's not that the moon dominates or the sun is unimportant. They're both important because of this sort of cosmic accident that the two forces sort of cancel out. The two effects, rather, cancel out, mass and distance. Okay, so because the sun and the moon are both important, sometimes the sun and moon tidal effects add up and make for a larger tide, and then sometimes they cancel each other out and make them for a smaller tide. So the larger tide is called the spring tide, the smaller tide is called the neap tide. And we get these two tides depending on the alignment of the Earth, Moon, Sun system. On the top panel, we have what's called syzygy. So this is when the Sun, Earth, and the Moon are all aligned. You could draw a straight line that goes through all of them. And what this means is that whether the Moon is in between the Sun and the Earth or on the far side, either way, because there's two tidal bulges on either side, the lunar and the solar tidal bulges lie on top of each other, and they constructively interfere. You can kind of think of tides as a wave. Actually, the mathematical theory of tides treats them exactly as a wave. And so those two waves are constructively interfering and making for a larger tide. Whereas the alternate configuration is shown on the bottom, and that's called quadrature. So we have syzygy on top, this weird word, which means collinear. And on the bottom, we have quadrature, which basically means an L shape or a right angle. And so in that case, when it's an L shape, the tidal bulges for the moon and the sun are offset by a 90 degrees rotation, which means that the low tide of the sun is kind of canceling out partially the high tide from the moon and vice versa. And so that's when you have your weaker tides, called your neap tide. So you have your spring tide at syzygy and your neap tide at quadrature. A lot of the time when you sort of do the simple diagram for how the tides work, we think of the moon as being on the equator, but that's really not true. That would sort of simplify the analysis a little bit, but it doesn't happen to be true. So the moon is offset. If you think about the plane defined by the rotation of the Earth, so the equatorial plane, the moon is elevated relative to that plane at 28.5 degrees. And so what that means is that the tides aren't on the equator; they point at some angle. And so if you think about what happens when the Earth rotates within that tidal bulge, it means that you're going to get unequal tides. Because if you're sitting at a certain latitude, you might be in the high tide, and then when you rotate around to the other side of the planet, you're in sort of just the flank. You might be in the center of the bulge on one side, and just on the flank of the tidal bulge on the other side. And so you can get 2 high tides per day and 2 low tides per day, but they're not necessarily equal in size. Unlike if the moon was at the equator, they would be equal in size. Okay, other factors that sort of complicate from the simplest picture are that actually the moon's orbit around the Earth and the Earth's orbit around the sun, neither of them is exactly circular. They're both close to circular, but really they're ellipses. And so in an ellipse, as you go around your orbit, there are points on the orbit where you're closer and points on the orbit where you're further away. So this is a kind of a fairly small effect. But when the moon is closer to the Earth, because of that inverse square law of gravity, you get a stronger gravity force, and we get stronger tides. And so that's called perigee, when the moon is very close to the Earth, and it's called apogee when it's further away. And then when the Earth orbits around the sun, it's called perihelion. So peri means close in this case, and the A word, aphelion or apogee, means far away. Maybe apogee away could be a way to remember it. And so when the Earth is at perihelion and then the moon is at perigee, that's when you have the strongest tides. And so there's this special circumstance called proxygean tides when you have a spring tide, meaning the Earth, moon, and the sun are all lined up. That's in syzygy. And then also, if that happens at perigee, when the moon is closest to the Earth, that's when you have the highest tides. And we talked briefly, it's not a very important point, but we talked briefly about so-called supermoons, when the moon looks very, very big in the sky. And that's not an optical illusion, that's a real thing. And it's associated with the orbit of the moon and when the orbit of the moon is at perigee, so it's a little bit closer. Okay, so this diagram, very, very important to understand. I actually should mention the other diagrams that are very important to understand is that diagram with the resultant forces is very important, and the syzygy quadrature diagram, you should know that one as well. And then this one is quite important. And so this basically shows it's a sort of a graphical realization of that period of 2 tides per day, that pattern of 2 tides per day. That happens when we have an inclined tidal bulge, so the tidal bulge is not at the equator, it's pointed toward the moon, and people on Earth rotate through that tidal bulge, hitting 2 high tides per day. And so the top panel on the bottom, the top curve, shows what happens to a person who is starting as in the upper panel, the upper set of panels, which are progressing through time. So the person starts sort of on the top right of the leftmost planetary diagram there, and that's in the high tide. And then as they rotate through 24 hours, 24 lunar hours, they first go from that high tide, then to a low tide, and then the very interesting thing is the lower high tide in the middle. So that's when that person has rotated from the upper right to the upper left of that figure on the other side of the planet. And so now they're in a high tide, but kind of just barely. So they're just catching the flank of that other high tide. And so we have one higher high tide and one lower high tide per day. And then in addition to that, there's two low tides. And if you look at the diagram, you imagine that individual starting either in the northern hemisphere equator or southern hemisphere, you can convince yourself that the tidal patterns would look like those three curves that are shown there. So really understanding this diagram sort of shows that you understand the basic mechanisms behind what gives us the tidal patterns, and so this will, in some form or another, definitely be on the final. Okay, so that idealized picture always says you get two high tides per day, two low high tides per day. Two high tides and two low tides per day, but the high tides may not be the equal. The tides may not be the equal sizes. But in reality, there are more complications. For example, that model that we just talked about, the simple model doesn't include the effect of land, doesn't include the effect of the Coriolis force. There's basically no physics in it other than gravity. So when you include those other pieces of physics, you get more complicated diversity of tidal patterns. And so there are really three kinds of tidal patterns we see. So we see semi-diurnal, which is in the middle here, and that's on the right-hand side in the middle panel. And that's just two high tides and two low tides per day of approximately equal size. And so this is sort of what you expect to see near the equator in the simple model. Then there's also the mixed tides, which are sort of that's the standard case where we have two high tides, two low tides, but they're different heights. That happens very, very commonly. And then there's a very unusual pattern called diurnal. And this happens, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, although you don't need to know exactly where these things happen. And this we have one high tide and one low tide per day. And that's just odd because you have two tidal bulges, so you would think that there would be two tides, two high tides, but because of sort of local geographical factors of coastlines and dynamics, those two high tides are transformed into one. So near the coastlines, we are all familiar with the fact that we often observe the tides on the coastlines, the water level rising up and lowering down. And you can get some very interesting phenomena we're going to talk about too in coastal waters. And one of them is you can get amplification of the tidal range. So the tidal range is the height difference between high tide and low tide. And some places in the world you get terrifically high tides, and the Bay of Fundy is one of them. It's either the highest or one of the top few locations for tides in the world. Very interesting because it's very nearby in Atlantic Canada. So the Bay of Fundy has this 17-meter tidal range, and there's a few different reasons for this. One of them is that the bay is just narrow, and so when the water floods in the flood tide, as we'll talk about, the narrowness of the bay just concentrates that water level. It also sort of gets shallower as you go in, so that it has another effect. But the other effect that has a bit more physics in it is resonance. And so we talked about this. So we talked about the example of pushing somebody on a swing. And so when you push somebody on a swing, they get a higher swing amplitude. And the way we push someone on a swing is we push them once per swing. So every time they come back, we push them once. And so the frequency at which we push them is equal to the frequency of the oscillation. We push them once per time they swing back and forth. If you were instead to somehow run back and forth on either side and push them randomly, you wouldn't get as big of an effect. Now, nobody does this because it would be very impractical, but you can do it in other types of oscillatory systems. And it's a very well-known thing in the physics of waves that when you drive a wave, meaning you have something that's oscillating naturally. Like if you sit on the swing and you just put yourself back initially, you'll swing at some certain frequency, and that's called the natural frequency. The same thing, like a pendulum has a natural frequency that it just swings at. But you can also give it pushes. You can drive it with a force, and it turns out that if you drive it with a force, if the forcing frequency, so how often you push it, is very close to the natural frequency of oscillation, then you get a big response, and it's called the resonant response. And so with this curve shows that. So on the y-axis is the amplitude of oscillations. That's like how big your swing is, and the x-axis is the frequency of the forcing. So how often you push. And what you see is that the amplitude has this big spike right at the natural frequency. So if you push it once per swing, you get a big response. And so the idea of how is this connected to the Bay of Fundy, you can kind of think of the Bay of Fundy like a bathtub. So the water sort of can slosh back and forth, just like when you sit in a bathtub, you create this wave, and it sloshes one way and then comes back. There's a characteristic time for that to happen. It's actually called the sloshing frequency. And at the Bay of Fundy, it just happens to be the case that the tidal frequency of basically two per day is the same as the frequency, or very close to the frequency, the natural frequency of the sloshing modes in the bay. And so we get this resonance effect where the oscillation of the water level is strongly enhanced. So it's kind of like the tidal forces are pushing the water in the bathtub of the Bay of Fundy at just the right rate, so that it's like amplifying a swing oscillation, and so we get very, very high tides. Very interesting. Another topic we talked about very briefly is tidal bores. So tidal bores are just this cool situation. You can look at the picture here, basically illustrates it, where when you have a flood tide, so you're going to a high tide and there's water coming into a river and the river outlets into the ocean, that the tide can be strong enough that it actually pushes the tidal waters over the river, and you kind of have a wall of water that makes its way upriver. And those are called tidal bores. And they happen under certain conditions. You don't need to know all the conditions. Terminology. So we talk about the high tide and low tide. There's currents associated with that. Obviously, if the water level is going to go up, that water has to come from somewhere. So there has to be a current that brings that water into that region. And so we call it a flood current when it's raising the water to high tide. We call it an ebb current when it's reducing the water level going to low tide. And then in between the flood tide and the ebb, in between the flood current and the ebb current, that means that at the boundary between those two, the water's going from going in to going out. So it's changing direction. So when something changes direction, it has to pass through zero. So there's a point in time where there's no velocity. The water is still, and that's called the slack water. So the high slack water happens right at the peak of the high tide, and the low slack water happens at the trough of the low tide. A cool example that we talked about, so this is particularly interesting for people that are interested in biology and ecology. There has been, over time, evolution of certain organisms to take advantage of the tidal cycles. And so the grunion is a really, really cool example of this. I didn't know this before I started teaching the course, but it's in the book, which I thought was really, really interesting. So the grunion are these cute little fish. They're little silvery fish. They're shown at the bottom. And they have a very interesting life cycle in terms of how they lay their eggs. So what they do is they wait until the spring tides. Remember, the spring tide happens at syzygy, when the Earth, Moon, and Sun are all lined up. And when the water level is at the highest, the grunions, they swim up the beach, and then they lay their eggs in the sand. And then the next day, the tides don't get as high, because now we're going from spring to neap. And that happens over the course of about a week. So the next day, the tide doesn't reach quite as high up the beach, and so the water doesn't wash away those waves. And so over those few days, as the tide is decreasing, the grunions lay their eggs in the sand, and then those eggs are protected. They get to develop in the sand, and then by the time the tidal cycle, about 2 weeks later, gets back to the spring tide, the eggs are now ready to hatch. And so at that point, that water, the tidal the high tides, as the moon and the sun and the earth all get lined up into syzygy, that those tidal levels rise up, and then now they reach the point at the beach where those eggs were laid, and then washes them back out, and then the little grunions can continue with their life cycles. So just a very cool example of how evolution can cause organism life cycles and ecosystems to kind of come together in unison to benefit these species that have evolved in that way. We also talked about tide generating power. This is a sort of a brief point, but there's a couple of quick things I just want to point out that are important. So most forms of electricity generation work as complicated ways to spin turbines. I talked about this in class. So, when you burn coal, you heat. You turn that thermal energy to boil water to create steam to spin a turbine. Nuclear energy does the same thing. Solar energy works a little bit differently. Solar energy is not turbine based, but wind energy obviously is a turbine. Hydroelectric is a turbine. You're converting kinetic energy, the motion of something, usually water or steam. You're taking that kinetic energy, using it to spin something. That spinning thing moves magnets around, and then electricity is produced by these magnets and going through wires, which is covered in courses in electricity. So tidal power is obviously we have motion that's going back and forth, so you could use that to spin a turbine, and people do. And this obviously has lots of good aspects to it. So it's very clean, it's a renewable resource. The tides are driven by cosmic, astrophysical forces, so that it's totally renewable and clean. Is in use in some locations. There are some, we talked about a power plant in France, and it's likely that in the future more energy will be extracted from tides. However, the downsides are also important to know. So there's ecological downsides, so we'll just cover those first, and I'll get to the technical stuff. So the ecological downsides are, things like marine noise. Marine noise is very bad for certain organisms. Animals can just get harmed by the turbines. It can change the habitats, and so there are ecological consequences. But another major difficulty in using the energy like tides is that it's cyclical. So when you have a flood current happening, that flood current, you're moving from low tide to high tide, that's spinning a turbine as water floods into the bay. But then at the high slack water, you're not really spinning the turbine, you're not really getting anything. And then when you have the ebb current, when the water floods back out of the bay, you also have electricity. So you're kind of getting electricity in an uncontrolled way. In burning of fossil fuels or nuclear fuel or whatever, we can control when we get the electricity. But with tidal power, you could be getting more than you need at some times and not enough at other times. And so what we need is techniques to incorporating other physical concepts to store that energy somehow, so that we can get it back out when we need it later, maybe when the tides are at slack water. And so these are called energy to X solutions. And the key example that I'm aware of is energy to hydrogen. And so what this means is you use the tides are generating energy spinning this turbine. And when you're generating lots of energy, what you use is you funnel that electricity to electrolyze water. So what that means is, so water's H2O. So it's got 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. And if you take 2 water molecules, that means you have 4 hydrogens total, 2 oxygens total. And you can split that up into 2 hydrogen gases, 2 copies of H2 and 1 copy of O2, oxygen gas. And there's just a reaction that can happen when you run electricity through water that breaks up the water molecules into these 2 gases. And then hydrogen is a fuel that you can burn. It's a clean burning. It burns into water. And so it doesn't produce any carbon or anything like that. So if we use the power from the tidal turbines to electrolyze water, we produce hydrogen gas, which we can later burn to recover that energy. And so that's a way of chemically storing the energy that's produced by tidal power that allows us to get around this problem of not being able to control when the turbines are spinning. Okay, so now this is a totally new topic. So that was the material on tides. So make sure that you pay close attention to that. And so the next topic is called geoengineering. So this is not on the slide here, but geoengineering is the general idea that rather than merely try to reduce emissions to slow the rate of climate change, that something that is possible is that we could take active steps to modify the climate on purpose to try to lower the temperature. And so this is a very controversial idea because people worry about side effects, and that's very legitimate. And most people that work in climate science do not advocate that we should do geoengineering. But it's kind of like an emergency lever that we're doing research on now, in case in the future it is necessary for some unforeseen reason. Okay, so the method of geoengineering that we actually talked about in class is called iron fertilization. And so it's based on the idea of the biological pump. And so the basic concept of the biological pump you should understand. All the details of this plot are totally unnecessary. But the key idea is that the atmosphere has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. It has a high concentration of carbon dioxide because we keep emitting it. And the ocean slowly uptakes that carbon from the atmosphere because the ocean has a lower concentration because it's gradually absorbing. We're constantly putting more and more into the atmosphere. That spikes the atmospheric concentration, and the ocean is kind of slowly catching up. How that absorption works is that carbon dioxide from the lower levels of the atmosphere gets absorbed into the surface ocean through dissolution. But then biology can get involved. And so the organisms that are in the ocean can actually use that carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis and to incorporate the carbon atoms from that carbon dioxide into their biological materials, into what makes up their cells. And that also can happen in terms of shells or whatever aspect of their bodies. And then when those organisms die, they can sink to the bottom, and they might be partially processed by bacteria or whatever on the way down. But to the extent that those organisms sink to the bottom, that takes those carbon atoms and just puts them on the seafloor, and then over long geological timescales they get recycled. But on human timescales, and even timescales of hundreds of years, that carbon effectively is gone, and it's not in the atmosphere causing global warming. So that's called the biological pump. CO2 from the atmosphere gets absorbed into the surface ocean, gets incorporated by organisms in the surface ocean into their biological structures, and then after those organisms die, they sink to the bottom where that carbon is kept safely away from the atmosphere. So that's called the biological pump. So the idea of iron fertilization is to somehow stimulate the biological pump to be more active, draw down more CO2, and in that way kind of pump CO2, harmful CO2, out of the atmosphere and store it in the deep ocean. So the reason that this is possibly can be possible is that there are certain regions of the ocean where there's a lot of potential for biological pumping, but that aren't currently active. And so those are called high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions. That's an important concept. So microorganisms in the ocean that do photosynthesis, they need a bunch of different things, nutrients, to be able to function. And so some of those are called macronutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus, N and P. But then there are also micronutrients that are needed in much lower levels, and iron is one of them, and there are also other micronutrients. And so there are some places on Earth where there's lots of phosphorus and nitrogen. So that would be good for growing conditions, but they're limited in the micronutrients, so there's not enough iron or whatever. And so even though in some sense resources are abundant, biology still can't grow. And so those are the high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions. They're high in nutrients because they're high in NMP, and they're low chlorophyll because nothing's really growing, so there's nothing growing in those regions. So there's no chlorophyll in the water. And so the idea is if we added those micronutrients that are needed directly to those regions on purpose, take some iron, grind it up into dust, and just dump the dust in the ocean, and then let the biology take advantage of that, could we stimulate biological productivity, and then which would then pump carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean? So this has been tried. And on the sort of bottom of this figure on the right-hand side, this is a satellite photo of ocean chlorophyll. There was actually an experiment done. It's been tried a few times near Alaska. And you see that little hot spot of chlorophyll. That's where they fertilize the ocean with iron. So you put in this iron that eliminates that micronutrient limitation, that allows biology to grow and, in principle, draw down carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in the deep ocean. So this is basically, it's definitely possible. It has been tried, and the results have been successful. But it's still considered to be a bad idea. because it can lead to other harmful effects, such as harmful algal blooms, and I think disrupting the nutrient balance of other nutrients that are in place in that region. And so generally people think that this is it's an interesting and correct scientific idea that this can be done, and sort of it reinforces our understanding of the whole system that we can do this. But it's not taken seriously anymore as a proposal to cool the climate. Okay, so that was geoengineering. And the next topic we talked about was how do climate models work? So what are the components of a climate model? And this is going to feed into the climate modeling lecture we had. So there are many different types of climate models, but I'm going to talk about the sort of flagship gold standard types of climate models called IPCC class. And IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They put out a report every few years talking about sort of the state of global climate. And the IPCC reports use the state-of-the-art, top of the line, best, most sophisticated models with all the bells and whistles and all the best physics we can come up with. And these models take weeks and weeks to run on the computers to generate their predictions. And then sort of we analyze that data and summarize it into these reports. Those models are called GCMs, and GCM can either stand for Global Climate Model or General Circulation Model, depending on sort of whether it has an ocean and an atmosphere or whatever. Just know that there's two that can be but they basically are essentially the same thing. And these models contain sub-models. So the models are so complicated that no one person understands all the details, but they're broken up into different pieces. So there's an atmospheric piece, an ocean piece. Often there's an ice piece called the cryosphere. And there are models for vegetation. So maybe this is like what kind of trees, or is it desert versus plains or whatever. And then there's radiation, and so radiation tracks how the solar radiation and also the terrestrial radiation is affected by clouds and reflections and all that kind of thing. And so all five of these are sort of separate, and then they're coupled together. And so I'll talk about how they're coupled. But to put these models on a computer, so whenever we have a physical system that exists in like reality, it's continuous, right? So if you ask how many points of space are in, say, a 1-inch distance, it's an infinite number of points, or you can get down to the atomic scale and say it's a huge number of atoms. But computers can't handle that. So what we need to do is make it a finite number, a discrete, some large but limited number of data that we can use to characterize the climate. This is called discretization. And so what's shown here in the diagram is we basically take the Earth's surface and we break it up into these little cubes, these little volumes. And that can be done in a ton of different ways. And the idea is that in each of these boxes, we assume that everything is uniform. So we only have, every variable of the climate, so the sea surface temperature, or the temperature, the pressure, the humidity, velocity, things like that, they have one value within each box at each time. And so we're sort of treating the inside of those boxes as if there's nothing going on. But we'll get back to parameterizations, which is the way we sort of deal with the fact that really we know there is something going on inside those boxes. So discretization is you take the Earth's surface and you break it up into these grid boxes within which we assume things are uniform, characterized by only one value, for example, for humidity, rather than normally we think of humidity varies from place to place. Then the other component is called the marching scheme. So we take this discretization, that makes our climate a finite set of numbers. Like you could list them all. Like here's all the variables of the climate. And it would be millions of numbers, but it's still a finite list. It's not infinite. And we put that into a computer code, and what the computer code does is it takes that list of data at one time, and then uses it to predict it a short time down the road, like maybe 10 minutes later. So it'll take the current atmosphere, ocean, ice sheets, the current vegetation, and it says based on that, and using physical laws, which are represented as mathematical equations, I'm going to predict it 10 minutes from now. And so that's what that equation, the next step of the atmosphere is equal to the current step plus a little difference. because of course in only 10 minutes the atmosphere is only going to change a little bit, so we don't need to totally recalculate everything. We just nudge it into the future based on what we know about physics. So for example, if there's a weather system in the jet stream blows from west to east, right? So 10 minutes later, if you have a low pressure system, it's going to be 10 minutes worth of distance propagated down to the east as the jet stream blows things from west to east. And that's kind of how the models work. The physics that goes into it is things like conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, which is also called F equals ma Newton's law. And then energy considerations, thermodynamics, things about water vapor, and all those different pieces of physics come in, and they all come in terms of mathematical equations that allow us to advance the atmosphere forward. The different models are not independent. So if you just break up the climate into atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, like you can't treat those things totally separately because of course the atmosphere and the ocean, they influence each other. Heat from the ocean influences the ice and so forth. And so the models are coupled, and coupled just means that they're connected to each other, they influence each other, and that this is represented in the mathematical equations. And so a couple of ways in which they interact is the ocean, so the atmosphere, the surface winds from the atmosphere produce a stress. They produce a force on the ocean surface, and this can generate waves, for example, and also can affect currents. And then the atmosphere and the ocean, they also exchange heat, and you can see how it can become complex because the heat exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean depends on the sea ice cover. So if you have sea ice in a particular model grid cell, you have a certain grid box. If that grid box has some sea ice content, then we need to adjust the heat transfer between the atmosphere and the ocean in that box based on the sea ice content. And so there's lots and lots of these couplings. This is just a few examples. And so the ice sheets are also involved, vegetation is also involved. All the models are coupled. So how can we simulate this in terms of computer power? So as I said, we do the discretization, which takes the continuous climate and breaks it down into discrete pieces, discrete grid boxes. And so that basically turns the climate into like a spreadsheet or like a list of data, one spreadsheet per each time. And but how much, how large is that spreadsheet? So how can we put a number on how much data we'll really have if we take the whole climate, we break it up into grid boxes, and we put it in a spreadsheet? So if you wanted to capture all of the physics, so this diagram here is just a generic diagram of turbulence, and so the red and the blue is the direction of spin. But the key thing is, you imagine these are little vortices. That the red and the blue just is showing the rate of spin of the local fluid. But the key thing is here that there's vortices of different sizes and different shapes. So there's larger ones, and there's little tiny dots, and then there's like ones that look like little smears. And so if you want to accurately represent and sort of simulate in high fidelity all of the physics that goes on in the climate system, you would need to simulate objects that are as large as weather systems and larger, so maybe hundreds and thousands of kilometers, down to actually tiny scales of about a millimeter, because in the ocean, the smallest little whirls and vortices are about 1 millimeter across. And so you don't need to look in detail at this calculation here, but if you just estimate it, you would need to represent that range of scales, 1,000 kilometers down to 1 millimeter. You basically need to have grid boxes every 1 millimeter everywhere on Earth, or at least everywhere in the ocean. And so if you do that estimate of how many grid boxes will we need based on 1 millimeter separating them and the actual size of the Earth, you get 10 to the 27 grid boxes, a huge number. And in each box, we need to have a floating point number, or a real number for temperature, salinity, pressure, velocity, humidity, etc. Each one of those numbers on a computer takes up 4 bytes of memory. So we don't normally talk about bytes and that kind of thing anymore because it's such a small unit. But fundamentally, a single number on a computer in memory takes 4 bytes. And if we have 10 to the 27 grid boxes, 4 bytes in a number, a bunch of numbers, temperature, salinity we need to have in each grid box. That works out to about 10 to the power of 16 terabytes. 10 to the 16 terabytes. So not 16, 10 to the 16. So this is an absolutely unfathomably large amount of data. And no computer that we have today or that we will have in the foreseeable future has anywhere near the capacity to deal with that amount of memory. So we cannot, the point is, it's not possible in practice because of the limitations of our computer technology to simulate a weather system in the atmosphere and a millimeter scale vortex together in the same code without making any approximations. That's not possible, and it won't be possible in our lifetimes. So we do other things to try to get around that. So we can't resolve, it's called, or we can't simulate the physics from across all scales, the largest and the smallest. But it turns out we also can't just ignore the small scale stuff. That's the first thing you would try. You say, okay, let's just ignore all the small stuff. It's small, it probably doesn't matter. It turns out if you do that, you get everything completely wrong, and the climate makes no sense, because those small things collectively, even though they're small, there are very many of them, and they collectively have a big effect. And so what we need to do is basically make up approximations that sort of model the effect of the small scale stuff. That small scale stuff is called sub-grid scale, or SGS, because it's below the scale. It's happening within a grid box. That tries to take into account the effect of those small scale things without actually directly calculating them. And those things are called parameterizations. So the parameterization is the approximation that we put into the model to model the sub-grid scale physics that's missing because our discretization has too few grid boxes. The grid boxes are too large. And this is just an example of a particularly notoriously complicated type of parameterization called the cloud microphysics. So inside a cloud, clouds are not at all simple. There are many phase transformations and all sorts of physics happening inside of a cloud that leads to ultimately to precipitation in different forms. So like, why does it snow sometimes and rain sometimes and hail other times? And why is the snow sometimes larger and sometimes smaller? All of these things are sort of modeled within these cloud microphysics parameterizations. But as you can see, they're very, very complicated. And they're called parameterizations because lots of individual numbers called parameters go into these things that track how much rain gets converted into Graupel or snow or whatever. And we have to kind of estimate these numbers based on physical ideas or maybe observations, laboratory experiments. It's kind of a rough approximation that we put into climate models, and then we hope that it's okay, and we do our best over time to develop new and better parameterizations to more accurately model the subgrid scale physics. So that, of course, the use of parameterizations and the fact that we're not directly calculating all the physical laws, we're making some assumptions. And so that leads to model uncertainty. So when we make climate predictions, we want to know how much faith should we have, or like what are the error bars? Whenever you present a number in science, you should give an error bar. Say we know this value, the length of something is 10 centimeters plus or minus a certain amount, right? And so when we do climate model prediction, we have to do the same thing. We say we have a certain confidence that the temperature is going to warm by a certain range. And the fact that we put in all these parameterizations has a major contribution to the uncertainty, because those parameterizations are not exact. We can never really know exactly how good they are. We can experiment with them and test them. So there's all sorts of uncertainty in the models themselves. The models are known to be flawed, which does not mean they're useless. It just means that they're imperfect. So that's a source of uncertainty. And then another source of uncertainty is chaos. So when we talked about the Lorentz equations earlier in the course, this convection model, we said that if you have two simulations that initially start from the same point, in time, they will be very, very different from one another because of the idea of chaos and the butterfly effect. You have a small change, and then that change amplifies and amplifies and amplifies over time, and then eventually the butterfly is flapping its wings in some part of the world affects the hurricane track in another part of the world. And that's not an exaggeration or a sort of a pop science simplification. That's literally true. And so that's happening in climate models also. And so what we have to do to try to reduce these uncertainties is run many, many runs with slightly different parameterizations and slightly different initial conditions and data, and that kind of gives us a broad picture of the statistics of what our predictions are. And one run of a climate model means very little, but if you run hundreds or thousands of runs of different models, you can sort of get a picture of what's consistent between these and what's very trustworthy, and what's really model dependent or chaotic and really can't be relied upon. And then this is just a figure from my probably the favorite talk I've ever seen in science, which was by Dr. Clara Deser, who's a senior scientist at NCAR down in the US, does atmospheric research. And her group ran this thing called the Large Ensemble, where they took one climate model. So they took a single model with the same parameterizations, didn't change anything about the model. But what they did was they initialized the model like 100 times or 30 times or something, and they just changed the initial state of the temperature field in the model by numerical precision. So computers generally have 8 decimal places in numbers. That's called single precision. And she just tweaked the last decimal place. So the temperature might have been like 2.5789025 degrees, and she just changed the last decimal place around the world. So it's imperceptible noise that you could never ever notice. And then ran the models out and looked at the climate change trends that were observed in different model runs. And I sort of just cherry picked 2 of them here. And this is showing the winter temperature trend, so the climate warming rate, and it's a 30-year warming rate. So over 30 years, how much do you warm? And if you look at the top panel, if you look at where Newfoundland is, it's in a red spot, which means we'll get about 4 or 5 degrees of warming over 30 years. Very, very significant amount of warming. But then if you look at the bottom model, we're in a blue spot, which actually says that we're going to cool. So rather than warm by 5 degrees, we might cool by 1.5 degrees. And both of those results are completely consistent with the physics of the climate model that was used to generate them. Now, that doesn't mean that the climate predictions are totally random or don't make any sense, or they're totally they're arbitrary or ignorable. Because if you look at the map, many features are the same. Overall, the globe is warming. We have red colors overall. Russia in both of them is warming quite a bit. The poles tend to warm a lot in these types of simulations. That's called polar amplification. But the point is that even things like a 30-year climate trend are subject to the butterfly effect. And when we're talking about especially regional climate change, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's very little uncertainty that when we add CO2 to the climate overall warms, and there's not much uncertainty to the rate of global warming in terms of a global average temperature increase. But for many practical purposes, people want to know, is Newfoundland going to warm or cool? Are we going to get wetter or drier? What about Ontario? What about Quebec? And what about Bangladesh? What about specific regions? And those predictions are highly uncertain because of the fundamental intrinsic uncertainty of chaos, which operates just in the butterfly's wings, it operates in the Lorentz equations, and it even operates in climate models. I just find that so fascinating, and I was blown away when I saw this result. I was totally shocked. Okay, the final topic, we'll talk about the last topic, and then I'll briefly talk about the guest lecture, those planetary climates. We sadly didn't get quite time to finish this, so I think I'll incorporate more about this into the course next year. So how do we test these climate models? So we want to predict climate in the future, and we want to understand today's climate. But we don't really have a lot of ways to test our models, because unlike in experimental physics or particle physics or something, where if you want to know how do 2 electrons interact, you can just smash millions and millions and millions of them together and measure statistically what happens and get highly accurate data. With the climate, we only have one Earth, and so we can't do really experiments to any real extent. And so there's 2 ways to. And so how do we know if our climate models are really good? Because we're only applying them to one data point, basically one climate we have now. So how we do that is 2 ways. One way we can look at the climates of other planets and see if we apply our same models with our same physics to those planets, do we get the right climate? And the other is looking at Earth's climates in the past, which is paleoclimate. So if you look at planets in the solar system, here I've shown Earth, Mars, and Venus here. The surface temperatures are dramatically different, especially Venus has a 730 degree Kelvin surface temperature. The Earth is 288, which is about 15 degrees or so. And there's a few factors that influence the surface temperature of a planet. So one is how close you are to the sun. The closer you are to the sun, the more radiation you receive. Another one is your albedo, so it's how much you reflect back to space. So the higher your reflectivity, the lower the temperature generally. And then the other very important thing is the greenhouse effect. So when you have an atmosphere, especially a thick atmosphere, that atmosphere traps heat, and that raises the surface temperature. And so actually that's what's happening on Venus. The reason for Venus's tremendously high surface temperature is because it has a very, very strong greenhouse effect. But so how do these factors interact to actually set the temperature? Can we make an estimate of what the temperature should be based on these principles? And so this is the simplest kind of climate model, actually. You can actually call this a climate model, and they're called energy balance climate models. And so the idea of an energy balance climate model is that we say that in equilibrium, the Earth must be receiving as much radiation from the sun as it is losing. It must receive as much energy as it is losing. If it was constantly receiving excess energy, we would warm up and warm up and warm up. And so the two must be in balance. And so the energy in comes in from the sun. It depends on the distance from the sun. That's roughly constant in time. And then energy out is partially it's reflected, so that's the albedo. And then the other component is blackbody radiation. So blackbody radiation is this fact that all objects that are at temperatures higher than absolute zero just naturally emit radiation. They lose energy by emitting radiation. And this is how thermal imaging works. So that these cameras here are seeing the heat. The reason they're able to see heat is because those hotter areas are emitting more radiation. And so you can see excess radiation coming from hot regions. So the person's head or their hands are brighter in thermal imaging, and the cooler areas are dimmer. And so the idea is that these two effects of absorbing solar radiation and then losing radiation to blackbody radiation, those must be in balance. And so we have an equation here: E in, incoming radiation, has to equal E out, outgoing radiation. And outgoing radiation, turns out, depends on temperature, because you emit more the hotter you are in terms of blackbody radiation. It's actually very sharp dependence. If you double the temperature in Kelvin, you get a 16-fold enhancement in the outgoing blackbody radiation. And so we can actually solve this equation for the temperature. But the key thing is just to notice that this is this balance between incoming solar, outgoing blackbody, and that blackbody depends on the temperature of the Earth. So how much energy do we get in? You can, based on the parameters of the sun, it turns out that at the Earth's location, so again, we have an inverse square law here, so as you get further away from the sun, the radiation gets spread out more and more, and so you're getting less and less radiation at a particular point. At the Earth's location, you get about 1361 watts per meter squared. You don't need to memorize any of these numbers, but just know the idea of the inverse square law and that we're getting energy from the sun. And then the Earth absorbs that radiation in an area equal to its cross-sectional area, so pi r squared. And then that's the total absorption. So we have here the power absorbed. The second formula is S naught. That's that 1361 times pi r squared. And then that total radiation, as the Earth is rotating over the day-night cycle, that radiation kind of gets averaged over the whole Earth's surface. And so you can think of that total power divided by 4 pi r squared, the Earth's surface area, gives us 340 watts per meter squared. That's a very typical, called top of atmosphere number. So that's the amount of radiation that's coming in at the top of the atmosphere before it's been affected by clouds or albedo or absorbed or anything like that. That's just the total amount of energy at the top of the atmosphere that's coming into the Earth system. Now, some of that's reflected away by albedo. So the Earth's global mean planetary albedo is about 0.3. And that's the average over a highly different places that have very different albedos regionally. So ice has an albedo of something like 90%, so almost almost all the radiation is reflected back to space, but dark blue water absorbs like 95% of the energy. And so the average of that over the whole planet turns out to be about 0.3. And of course, that changes in ice age cycles, for example. When you account for reflection, we're left with about 240 watts per meter squared that actually sort of enters into the Earth system without being reflected. And the last topic we had time to cover is how the energy out works, and so this is black body radiation again. And so we can think of so we've said that all objects above 0 Kelvin, they emit black body radiation. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but they're not critical. Dark matter doesn't do this, for example. But all everyday matter, people and ocean and gases and so forth, emit this black body radiation. And the reason is that matter, although it's generally electrically neutral, so for example, your coffee cup is electrically neutral because it's made out of particles that are charged, protons and electrons and neutrons, but there's the same amount of electrons as protons, so on the whole, there's no charge. And when the temperature is higher than absolute zero, the particles that make up your coffee cup, they're not stationary. They sort of jiggle around, and at the atomic level, there's no friction, so they just jiggle forever. They never stop jiggling. And as they move around like that, those moving charges emit electromagnetic radiation. This is like how an antenna works. In an antenna, you have a current that's going up and down the antenna. Those are moving charges, and that emits radio waves in that case. So in the case of black body radiation, you have these particles that are moving around randomly, and that's sort of throwing off random waves all the time. And there's a very important formula at the bottom of the Stefan-Boltzmann law that says that the area, the energy emitted by black body radiation per surface area is F is equal to sigma times T to the 4th power. So sigma is just a numerical constant. That's not too important. But T to the 4th power is very important. So T is the temperature in Kelvin of the object. And the key thing is that it's very, very strongly dependent on the temperature to the 4th power. So if you double the temperature, you get a 16 times increase in the amount of radiation. And so basically what happens was if the Earth started out cold, this is not really what happened. The Earth started out hot because of how it was formed. But if the Earth started out cold, then the sun would warm it, and initially it'd be emitting very little radiation because its temperature would be small, so T to the 4th would be very small. And then the radiation continues to come in from the sun, and the planet warms, starts emitting more and more radiation, up until the point where the amount that it's radiating actually balances the amount that it's getting from the sun, and at that point it stops warming. And that's the equilibrium temperature. And we didn't get time to do this, but if you combine these things mathematically, you can make a specific prediction for what the Earth's temperature should be. You get it pretty close, and then you can get it even more accurate if you include atmospheric effects, greenhouse effect. And this is sort of the simplest energy balance climate model. So that was the last topic that I covered. And then just one slide. This is this is the one testable slide from Audrey's lecture, which is just about the 3 kinds of climate models that are often used. So I talked about GCMs when I was talking about climate models just earlier in this review lecture. I was referring to general circulation models, which are these very complex models that have lots of physical equations in them and lots of grid points and so forth. And those are the flagship state-of-the-art models. On the other hand, on the left-hand side, energy balance models, these are these energy in equals energy out models. And these are really, really simplified, but it's barely even a computer code. It's almost just like a few lines on paper. And so those are very useful for getting sort of sanity estimates, like for saying, like, do we have whatever these complicated GCMs are predicting, it better be roughly consistent with energy balance, because we know that physical principle is true. And so energy balance models are very useful, and they also range in complexity. We were just taking energy in and black body, but you could imagine incorporating clouds to some degree, atmosphere to some degree. You could imagine incorporating Milankovitch forcing, which is the changing in the solar constant, and various things like that. And so that's the energy balance model. And it turns out the thing that Audrey was talking about, which is very interesting, is Earth models of intermediate complexity, which sort of sit in between. They're a lot more sophisticated than energy balance models, but they're not nearly as computationally demanding as the general circulation models. And of course, that means they have to have a lower resolution, so they have fewer grid boxes. It also means that they have a lot more simplifications and parameterizations in them. And the benefit of these Earth models of intermediate complexity is that you can incorporate all the physics. So in a GCM, you might often might have a GCM that doesn't have an atmosphere or doesn't have an ice model, or if it could be just an ocean model or just an atmosphere. But in the Earth models of intermediate complexity, because we're making so many simplifications, we can afford to add in extra things like couple in all the different parts of the climate system. And these are very useful if you want to run very long simulations, say go back into the deep past or into the far future, or if you want to run huge ensembles of simulations to get a lot of statistical data. And of course, you sacrifice in accuracy, but the benefits that you gain in statistical understanding and in being able to look over long time ranges makes them also separately very, very useful. So it's not the case that any one of these types is the best. They all do different things, and they're all used in state-of-the-art research today. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope that this was a helpful review, and best of luck in your preparation for the final exam.